Mark had mastered the art of invisibility long before college began. He wasn't the kind of student who walked into a room and drew attention. He was the kind who blended with the walls, who slipped into a lecture hall unnoticed and slipped out again just as quietly. In the cafeteria, where voices clashed against one another and trays rattled like cymbals, he kept his head down. He walked a straight line to his table in the corner, never raising his eyes for longer than a second. That was his safety. No stares, no whispers, no risk of being caught in someone else's cruel amusement. But invisibility is fragile. All it takes is one wrong step to shatter it. For Mark, that step came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the cafeteria buzzed with too much noise and the air smelled of grease and something overcooked. His tray wobbled slightly in his grip as he weaved through the crowded aisles. He had done this routine 100 times, eyes fixed on the floor, careful not to stumble, careful not to invite attention. But this time, a loose strap from an abandoned backpack stretched out like a trap across the narrow path between tables. Mark's foot hooked on it before he even realized what had happened. The stumble was sharp, and it sent his balance spiraling. The tray slipped from his hands, crashing against the tiles with a clatter that sliced through the chatter of the room. A cup tipped over, orange juice spilling in a wide arc across the floor, seeping quickly under the shoes of the students nearest him. His books, tucked tightly under his arm only a second earlier, tumbled out, scattering in every direction like pieces of himself exposed for the world to see. For a heartbeat, the entire cafeteria froze. Then came the laughter. Loud, jagged, merciless. It wasn't a single voice, but dozens overlapping, a chorus of amusement at his expense. Heads turned, fingers pointed. It was the kind of moment that made time stretch painfully, every second dragging out his humiliation. Mark dropped to his knees instantly, desperate to gather his books before the situation grew worse. His hands fumbled as he stacked them together, his chest burning with shame. He could feel the eyes on him, the way they pierced through his thin layer of invisibility until nothing of it remained. And then a shift. A voice broke through the noise. "You okay?" At first Mark thought he had imagined it. But then he saw him, Ryan. Everyone knew Ryan. He was the starting forward on the college basketball team, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and command attention without trying. He wasn't just popular. He was admired, the kind of student people gravitated toward instinctively. Mark had never spoken to him before, had never expected to. Their worlds were too far apart. And yet here he was, crouching down on the cafeteria floor, one of Mark's books in his hand. Ryan didn't smirk. He didn't laugh like the others. His face held no trace of mockery, no glimmer of superiority. He simply extended the book, his hand steady, his gaze direct. For a second, Mark hesitated. It felt like a trap, like the punchline of some cruel joke waiting to land. But the punchline never came. Ryan stayed there, patient, waiting. Finally, Mark reached out and took the book. Their fingers brushed for only an instant, but the contact felt sharper than the laughter still echoing around them. Then Ryan did something no one expected. He bent down further and began collecting the rest of Mark's scattered books, stacking them neatly before handing them over one by one. The cafeteria, once loud with jeers, grew quieter, as if the simple act unsettled the rhythm of the crowd. People watched, but Ryan didn't care. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though helping Mark wasn't unusual, as though this moment didn't demand spectacle. Mark clutched the books tighter than necessary, his pulse still thundering in his ears. The laughter had lost its sting, replaced instead by something more confusing, something harder to name. Ryan gave a small nod. "Careful next time," he said, and then walked back to his table as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Mark could feel it in the air, in the silence that followed him to his corner, in the curious stares that lingered longer than before. He glanced up once, half expecting Ryan to look his way again. But Ryan was already laughing with his teammates, casual and unbothered, as though the small act in the middle of the cafeteria hadn't meant anything at all. To everyone else, maybe it hadn't. But to Mark, it was different. It was the first time someone had stepped into the circle of his humiliation and pulled him out, not with a joke or with pity, but with something real. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't even familiarity. It was a crack in the armor of invisibility he had built for himself. And that, in itself, was dangerous. Because once someone notices you, truly notices you, invisibility is no longer an option. Under the bright lights of the campus library, when most students were already gone and the silence pressed against the windows like a second skin, Mark found himself sitting across from Ryan more often than he ever imagined he would. It didn't begin with some dramatic declaration, no bold decision to spend time together. It was quieter than that, accidental at first. A shared glance near the vending machines when the hallway was deserted, a pause in the corner of the library where the hum of laptops and the shuffle of papers couldn't quite reach. Ryan appeared in those places without fanfare, leaning against a wall, tossing a casual, "You're busy," that carried more weight than it should have. And Mark, though his instinct had always been to avoid attention, found himself nodding, following, choosing not to retreat. Ryan had a way of speaking that felt different when no one else was around. In public, he was the star athlete, the one who always had the right line ready, the easy grin that made everyone around him feel included. But in these stolen moments, when the world narrowed to just the two of them, his voice shifted. The confidence melted away, replaced by something sharper and more vulnerable. He asked questions that didn't belong to the surface-level chatter of college life. Questions like, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's plan? Or what would happen if you just stopped pretending for a day? He said it like a challenge, but his eyes told a different story, one that asked for reassurance, for someone to tell him he wasn't the only one thinking this way. Mark didn't always know what to say, but that didn't matter. Ryan seemed less interested in answers than in the relief of being able to voice the thoughts he usually buried. And in return, Mark found himself speaking more honestly than he ever had. Words came easier around Ryan, as though the usual pressure to shrink into the background dissolved. He admitted small things at first. The music he listened to alone in his dorm, the nights he sat awake wondering if anyone on campus would ever notice him for something other than a mistake. Ryan listened, really listened. His attention never flickered, not to his phone, not to the noise outside the windows, only to Mark. One night, as they sat in the farthest corner of the library where the lamps cast weak pools of light over scratched wooden tables, Ryan leaned back in his chair and said, almost offhandedly, "Everyone thinks I love being in the spotlight." He paused, waiting, maybe daring Mark to agree. When Mark stayed silent, he added, "Truth is, I'm exhausted. Every time I walk into a room, I'm already performing. People don't even realize it. They clap you on the back, call your name, laugh at your jokes, and none of it feels real. It's like living in a play where everyone else knows the script but me." His laugh was hollow, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't joking. Mark's chest tightened. He knew something about that. Not the pressure of being admired, but the pressure of erasing himself, of making sure no one noticed him enough to laugh. Different battles, same exhaustion. He wanted to tell Ryan that, but the words caught. So he gave the only truth he could manage. "I get it." It was enough. Ryan exhaled, long and uneven, as though someone had finally validated a truth he was terrified to admit. The nights continued like that, a series of small confessions shared between stacks of forgotten books, benches tucked under bare trees, and quiet hallways where only the buzzing lights bore witness. Sometimes Ryan talked about lying on the roof of his childhood home, making up constellations, naming them after people he'd never tell anyone about. Other times he admitted to sitting in his car for hours, parked at the edge of campus, not because he was lost, but because he didn't want to arrive anywhere. Mark didn't laugh. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened, and in return Ryan kept opening up, layer by layer, as though Mark's silence was the key he had been waiting for. It wasn't a friendship in the traditional sense. There were no loud inside jokes, no photos flooding social media, no constant messages buzzing at midnight. Their connection lived in the shadows, deliberate and fragile. They didn't need to fill every second with conversation. Sometimes Ryan just sat near Mark during study hours, scribbling random shapes in his notebook, waves, stars, fragments of words, without explaining. Mark never asked. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was steady, charged with something unspoken, a recognition that they were building trust in a world that expected them to play roles neither of them wanted. But the quiet bond carried its own danger. Mark felt it every time Ryan leaned closer, every time his eyes softened in a way no one else would notice. He felt it in the way his own pulse quickened at the thought of being seen with Ryan outside these hidden spaces. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, because the more they met, the more the line blurred between being invisible and being noticed. And Mark knew, deep down, that lines like that don't stay hidden forever. Someone would see. Someone would talk. And when that happened, the fragile sanctuary they had built might shatter under the weight of the outside world. For now, though, it held. And for the first time in his life, Mark wasn't sure he wanted to disappear. The moment that cracked everything open arrived when neither of them expected it. It was late morning, the gym alive with the echoes of sneakers squeaking against polished wood, basketballs thudding against the floor, the sharp whistle of the coach cutting through the din. Ryan and Mark had been paired together during a drill. It wasn't unusual. Ryan often guided him through practice, moving with an ease and confidence that made everything seem effortless. Mark had grown used to their rhythm, the back and forth of the ball, the quiet glance of acknowledgement, the way Ryan's movements seemed to anticipate his own. For a brief time, it felt safe, as though the noise of the gym had dulled into nothing more than background static. But safety is fragile. Mark's foot slipped just slightly on the polished surface. Not enough to make him fall, but enough to throw him off balance, enough to make his body jerk forward. Instinctively, Ryan's hand shot out and caught him by the arm, steady and firm. It lasted only a second longer than it should have, his fingers tightening with more care than necessity, their eyes locking in a way that burned through the noise around them. In that instant, time seemed to halt. The ball bounced away, forgotten. The gym might as well have emptied. All that existed was Ryan's grip and the silent charge between them. Then came a sound, a sharp laugh from the bleachers, drawn out and mocking. Another voice followed, a murmur laced with cruel amusement. They weren't loud enough for the coach to notice, but they didn't need to be. The tone alone was enough. Ryan's hand fell instantly, as though burned. His face hardened into blankness, his body retreating behind the practiced armor of indifference. He snatched up the ball, hurled it back with unnecessary speed, and the drill ended with a whistle that sounded more like a judgment than instruction. Mark didn't need to turn his head to know the damage had been done. He could feel it. The shift in the air, the way certain eyes lingered too long, the silence that stretched just a little too far before breaking into scattered whispers. When practice ended, Ryan didn't wait for him the way he usually did. He headed straight to the locker room, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, vanishing before Mark could even follow. The silence that followed wasn't just absence. It was heavy, deliberate, suffocating. For the rest of the day, Ryan didn't appear. Not in the cafeteria, not in the hallways, not in the library. It was as though he had folded himself into the spaces Mark couldn't reach, avoiding not just him, but the risk of what anyone else might see. That was when the whispers began to grow teeth. Passing groups in the corridor would pause mid-sentence when Mark walked by, exchanging looks that told him they had been talking about him, about Ryan, about what had happened in the gym. He caught fragments. Weird, saw that, what's going on? The words never landed directly, but they didn't have to. The laughter in the gym had been enough to plant the seed. By the end of the week, the shift was undeniable. Ryan wasn't avoiding him entirely. They crossed paths, exchanged brief nods, but the warmth was gone. No questions whispered in quiet corners, no pauses by the vending machines, no late-night conversations that stretched into confessions. He had retreated, his gaze sliding away whenever it lingered too long, his voice clipped, his presence more absence than anything else. What hurt Mark wasn't the silence itself. It was the fact that the silence no longer belonged to them. Before, their quiet had been deliberate, chosen, a sanctuary where words weren't always needed. Now the silence was loud with all the things Ryan wasn't saying, all the things he was too afraid to risk. It was silence filled with the weight of other people's eyes, other people's expectations, silence poisoned by shame that didn't even belong to them but pressed against them all the same. And then came the moment that made everything worse. Mark saw Ryan across the courtyard, surrounded by his usual circle of friends. Chris, loud as ever, leaning close, his grin sharp and knowing. Mark couldn't hear every word, but enough carried across the hum of voices. "You've changed. Don't go soft on us. What's with the quiet?" The words were bait, delivered with laughter, but there was nothing lighthearted about the look that passed over Ryan's face. He didn't laugh. He didn't defend himself. He just stared down at the table, his jaw tight, fingers clenching around the cup in his hand until his knuckles whitened. Mark recognized that look. The weight pressing down, the effort of holding still, of keeping up the performance even when the cost cut deeper than anyone else could see. And it was in that moment Mark understood that Ryan wasn't just pulling away from him. He was pulling away from himself, retreating into the mask that had kept him safe all these years. For Mark, the fracture was undeniable. What they had built in shadows and whispers now trembled under the scrutiny of daylight. Every glance in the hallway felt like a test, every silence between them louder than the laughter that had sparked it all. He found himself wondering not if Ryan cared, but if Ryan would ever have the courage to close the distance again. Because sometimes the line that divides you isn't miles wide. Sometimes it's only a few feet across, a few words unsaid, a choice left unmade. And yet it can feel impossible to cross. Chris had always been the kind of friend people noticed first when standing in a group. He was loud, confident, and unafraid to mock anyone around him, even Ryan, though with Ryan it often came disguised as jokes. The kind of remarks everyone was supposed to laugh at, brush off, and forget by the end of the night. But lately, Chris's laughter carried a sharper edge, one that dug under Ryan's skin even when no one else seemed to hear it. It happened one evening after practice when the team was gathered outside the locker room, the air still heavy with sweat and adrenaline. Chris leaned against the wall, smirking, his voice pitched just loud enough for everyone around to catch the words. "What's going on with you, man? You've been quiet lately. Different. Don't tell me you're going soft." His grin was all teeth, the kind that dared Ryan to argue, to make himself the target of another round of laughter. A couple of teammates chuckled, half-hearted, waiting to see how Ryan would respond. Ryan didn't. He forced a laugh, shallow and hollow, and muttered something noncommittal. But his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening as though the comment had struck deeper than he wanted anyone to see. To Chris, it was just another jab, another reminder of the role Ryan was expected to play, the unshakable athlete, the life of the group, the one who never faltered. But to Ryan, it was suffocating. Every laugh felt like another layer of weight pressing down, another piece of himself slipping away beneath the mask. Later that night, Mark found him outside, near the old trophy case in the dimly lit hallway where the glass reflected fractured shapes of long-forgotten victories. Ryan stood there, hunched slightly, his phone in his hand, but his gaze fixed on the floor. When he looked up, his eyes were heavy, carrying the kind of exhaustion no amount of sleep could cure. "I'm tired," he said quietly, and the words didn't sound like an excuse for missing homework or staying up too late. They were heavier, dragging up from someplace deep. "I'm tired of playing a part every time I walk into a room. I'm tired of pretending I'm fine when I'm not. Everyone expects me to be the guy they want, not the guy I actually am." Mark stayed silent, letting the words spill out. Ryan's voice grew sharper, tinged with anger, but it wasn't anger at Mark. With Chris, it's the worst. He's been my friend forever. We've done everything together, games, nights out, trips. But now, every time I'm not exactly the version of me, he remembers, he notices. He throws it back at me with those jokes that don't feel like jokes. And I can't stand it. I keep changing myself to keep him comfortable, to keep the team comfortable, and every time I do it, I feel like I'm disappearing a little more. He finally lifted his eyes to Mark, his voice breaking at the edges. "If I stop, I might lose him. But if I don't, I'll lose myself." The silence between them stretched, heavy but charged. Mark felt the weight of it, the raw truth that had been dragged into the open. He wanted to give Ryan some easy reassurance, some clever answer, but there wasn't one. So he spoke plainly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Hiding yourself costs more than being misunderstood ever will. You can bend yourself into 1,000 shapes for them, but in the end, you'll be the one breaking. And once you break, no one is going to fix that for you. Ryan's shoulders shifted, his fists unclenching slightly as though the words had struck the nerve he'd been afraid to face. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the flickering light above them. For a moment, he looked younger, smaller, stripped of the bravado that everyone else seemed to admire. "You make it sound so simple," he said, almost with a humorless laugh. "It isn't simple," Mark replied. "It's harder than anything, but the choice is still yours. You can keep living for what Chris wants, what the team expects, what strangers whisper about, or you can live for yourself. And that's the only choice that matters." The words hung in the air, and with them came a shift, subtle but undeniable. Ryan didn't respond immediately. He didn't promise anything or make some grand vow. But the way he looked at Mark carried something different now. Something raw, something grateful, something like relief. It was the first time in weeks that the silence between them felt like their own again, not stolen or poisoned by others. Yet the choice still loomed. Ryan knew he couldn't keep straddling both worlds forever. Chris would keep pushing, the team would keep watching, the whispers would keep circling. And eventually, he would have to decide, remain the version of himself that kept everyone else comfortable, or step into the truth that terrified him but set him free. That night, as they parted ways in the courtyard, Ryan didn't say goodbye. He just glanced back once, long enough for Mark to see the conflict still burning in his expression, long enough to know the decision wasn't made yet. But the weight of it was there, undeniable, pressing down on both of them. And Mark understood something with piercing clarity. When Ryan finally chose, it would change everything, for him, for Mark, and for the fragile connection they had built in the shadows. The cafeteria was already a storm of noise by the time Mark stepped inside. Trays clattering, voices overlapping in 100 careless conversations. He had grown used to slipping through these moments unnoticed, weaving between tables with his eyes low, carrying his food like a shield to the corner seat no one else wanted. But that morning felt different even before anything happened. The air was charged in a way he couldn't name, heavy with anticipation, as though the crowd was waiting for something without even realizing it. Mark reached his usual table, the one pressed against the wall, where he could fade into the background. He set down his tray, trying to ignore the restless hum of laughter echoing from the athletes' table at the center of the room. He didn't have to look to know Ryan was there. He could sense it, could always sense it now, like a pull in the air that unsettled him. He told himself not to glance over, not to search for what he might not find. But still, his eyes betrayed him. Ryan sat with his teammates, Chris leaning close as always, filling the space with two loud words and sharp laughter. Ryan wasn't laughing. His face was still, unreadable, but Mark could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched around the edge of his tray. Then it happened. Ryan pushed back his chair, not with hesitation, not with the casual shuffle of someone heading to refill a drink. No, he stood with deliberate steadiness, his every movement carrying the weight of intention. The noise in the cafeteria didn't falter at first, but Mark noticed the subtle shift. Eyes flicking up, forks pausing midair, conversations tapering into uncertainty. Ryan walked through the aisle, past his teammates, past Chris's raised eyebrows and half-smirk. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should have, dragging the attention of the room with him. Mark froze. For a heartbeat, he wondered if Ryan was going to walk past, if all of this was coincidence, if the distance between them was about to stretch wider again. But Ryan didn't pass. He stopped right in front of Mark's table, gaze steady, body unflinching. Without a word, he set down his tray and slid into the seat across from him. The effect was immediate. The cafeteria hushed in an unnatural way, a silence not born of peace but of shock. Conversations didn't die, they snapped. Whispers filled the void almost instantly, darting between tables like sparks catching dry grass. Mark could hear fragments even without trying. What's he doing? No way. Is that? Some voices were mocking, others incredulous, but all of them were watching. Ryan didn't look at them. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stares. He picked up his fork, speared a piece of food, and began eating as though the room wasn't holding its breath. His movements were calm, almost defiant in their normalcy. He didn't rush, didn't shrink, didn't give the room the satisfaction of nerves. Every gesture was a quiet refusal to perform for anyone else. Mark's throat was dry. He wanted to speak, to say something that would cut through the tension, but words felt unnecessary. The act itself said more than any sentence ever could. Ryan was sitting here, with him, in full view of everyone. That choice weighed more than any defense, more than any explanation. It was a declaration without sound. Across the room, Chris's grin faltered. Some teammates exchanged quick glances, uncertain, restless. A few shifted their trays away, distance creeping in as though Ryan's choice had made him unfamiliar to them. Others watched with narrowed eyes, silent but sharp in their judgment. Yet not everyone turned away. From the corner of his vision, Mark caught a few students nodding slightly, as though they understood something deeper, as though they respected the risk Ryan had taken by simply sitting where he did. The whispers swelled and faded, a tide that eventually blended back into the ordinary hum of the cafeteria. But nothing about the moment was ordinary. Mark could feel it in his chest, a trembling that was equal parts fear and awe. For weeks, they had built their connection in shadows, hidden behind quiet corners and unspoken words. And now Ryan had dragged it into the light with a single act. After a while, Ryan leaned back, his eyes finally meeting Mark's. There was no smile, no grand gesture, but there didn't need to be. His gaze carried the weight of his decision, the message clear: I'm not hiding anymore. The rest of the day carried the echo of that moment. In classes, Ryan chose the seat beside Mark without hesitation. In hallways, he didn't avert his gaze but matched his stride, unbothered by the eyes that followed them. Some friends drifted further away, their conversations stilted and forced, their laughter hollow when Ryan didn't join in. Chris tried once, a mocking comment thrown like a dart, but Ryan didn't take the bait. He answered with silence, turning back to Mark as though the words hadn't even landed. That silence cut deeper than any argument could. Others, though, grew closer. People who had never spoken to Mark before stopped him with a nod, a word of acknowledgement, a fleeting glance of respect. Small gestures, but powerful in their quiet way. It was as if Ryan's choice had given permission to others, too, a reminder that courage reshaped more than just the person who chose it. Still, the weight didn't vanish. The judgment lingered in subtle looks, in laughter that sharpened when they passed, in the undercurrent of disapproval from those who preferred Ryan's stay in the role they had written for him. But he didn't retreat. Each day, he showed up, steady and unflinching, holding the line he had drawn in the cafeteria. Mark understood the risk. Courage didn't erase cruelty, didn't silence gossip overnight. But it changed something fundamental. It shifted the ground they walked on, turned whispers into background noise instead of chains. And as the weeks unfolded, Mark realized that this, fragile and difficult as it was what real strength looked like. Not the strength to perform, not the strength to please, but the strength to exist openly, even when the cost was high. And though the path ahead was uncertain, though judgment would linger and some friendships would crumble, the act in that cafeteria proved one truth that neither of them could deny. Courage doesn't make the world easier, but makes life worth living.